Good evening. I'd like to start by thanking Sean for the very kind words of introduction, and also the Institute of Advanced Studies, and Susan Tecau and David Glantz for the opportunity to speak at the Inquiry Minds series of lectures. So today I'm going to talk about plastic pollution in the ocean, and the talk is actually co-authored with Julia Reiser, which I think is sitting in the back, which is one of the brightest PhD students that we have in UWA. And she's been responsible for the work that I will be showing on Australian waters, and I will be adding to her work on a global context for the extent of plastic pollution around the world. And I'd also like to acknowledge a number of co-authors, particularly Andres Cosar, who is the person that has been leading the global survey for the Malaspina expedition, and a number of co-authors that have participated, and also many institutions that have contributed to the work, and also to the source of funding for Julia Reiser, her scholarships, and also her sources of seed time in Australia, and the Malaspina expedition and the Med-Sea expedition, which will be about the Mediterranean and the global ocean, and you will see results from those, were funded by the Spanish Ministry of Research. So basically, I will be talking about trends in plastic production and the role of the oceans as the ultimate sink for plastic material, what impacts the plastic debris have on the ocean, how do we go about quantifying the amount of plastics in the ocean, in the open ocean, and also how it is distributed around Australia, the global distribution of the debris, and finally I will ask the question of where is the plastic gone, because as you will see, we cannot really account for all the plastic that we reckon has gone into the ocean, so it has to be somewhere. And the story starts in the 1950s when Time magazine published this photograph on an article called Thrown Away Living, where disposable plastic was celebrated as the advent of woman freedom from house duties. So no longer it was necessary to wash dishes and things like that, because you could just consume plastic items and then just throw them away. And that was supposed to bring great freedom to households by doing away with the needs to store things or to wash them and clean them. And in fact, that was a celebration, but it was the celebration of something that we don't quite regret, but we need to be carefully looking upon as one of the major threats into our oceans. And in the 1950s is when the capacity to produce massive amounts of plastics and disposable plastics in industrial ways was developed. And since, the plastic production has grown to about 300,000 tons in 2012. So the growth rate of our production of plastic has been impressive, and most of the plastic items that we produce are allocated for single-use plastics. So unfortunately, some of these and some of these that we are only going to use, once we purchase the item, we're going to use only for a few minutes, not even hours, and then throw away this plastic material. So we are producing increasing amounts of this plastic, and this plastic is built to be resistant in the environment, and therefore it is indeed resistant in the environment, and the lifetimes of these materials in the environments are decades, if not centuries. So eventually these plastic materials, all of this history of producing plastics accumulates somewhere, and the ocean is the ultimate sink of this long-lived debris, because stumbling through soils and garbage dumps and so on, eventually it is washed by rain, springs and rivers into the oceans, or even by storm sewers, and reaches the oceans where this material is accumulated in great amounts. And actually we don't know in how much great amounts, because we don't have as yet, until just today, a global estimate of the amount of plastic in the ocean. So I'll give you just a little story happening in south of Spain in 2012 about the significance of this plastic and the way it interacts with marine life. So in March 2012, a sperm whale stranded in the coast of Cádiz in the southwest of Spain, and my colleagues from the Spanish Research Council were called to come and conduct an autopsy to find out why the animal had died. Actually, conducting an autopsy on a sperm whale is something you don't do with very small gear. You need sort of very heavy duty to open the animal and look at the guts and do the autopsy on the animal. So this is a film of one of my colleagues from the Spanish National Research Council actually investigating the causes of death of the animal. So this animal, it was soon evident that the animal had died of ingesting very large amounts of debris. And the results were reported in this paper published this year in Marine Pollution Bulletin called As Main Meal for Sperm Whales, Plastic Debris. And the paper is accompanied by a series of photographs showing the wide range of plastic debris that the animal had inside, so ranging from pots to greenhouse cover material, plastic burlap, rope, plastic pots, hangers, dishwasher materials, plastic containers for different purposes, and all in all they were able to retrieve 18 kilograms of plastic materials from the guts of this animal that were clogging the animal to death. Now, when each of us looked into the ocean in Cádiz, we don't see that plastic. So it is somewhere, but we don't see it. But even if we don't see it, if we look deep into the ocean, that plastic is somewhere. And I'm going to show some examples of the amount of plastic that we can find also in the sediment, in the seafloor. And this will be coming from trawling surveys designed to assess the biodiversity of the deep sea, but in fact, more than animals, we are harvesting plastics. So there will be a series of photographs now that show in a tray the plastic collected by sampling devices going to about 1,000 meters in the seafloor in the Mediterranean from 4 different cruises. So in one of the cruises, called the Biofan cruise in the Western Mediterranean, in the Central Basin, so this is the sample of plastic material that was retrieved from 1,200 meters depth. This is another sample from the same cruise, another area that was surveyed, the plastic material that was retrieved. Here also the plastic material at 2,000 meters was accompanied by cans and also by glass bottles, another sample of the Western Mediterranean, and then you can go on and on with samples of the deep sea now containing very large amounts of plastic material. And in the Western Mediterranean, as in Western Australia, one of the features of the topography of the seafloor is that we have submarine canyons that focus the materials that are transported from the continental shelf into the deep sea. And using submersibles, colleagues in France have found that at the bottom of these canyons, then you can find literally mountains of plastic material, typically mostly bottles and water bottles accumulated, for instance, in the canyon of Marseille in France. But these very large items are easy to see, but in fact, most of the plastic material in the ocean is not that large. It's not something that you can find inside the guts of a whale. It's actually composed of very small particles that are less than 2 centimeters in size. So this is a photograph from Julia from one of her samples, where you can look at the size and shape of these materials. And this is another photograph, this time from the Malaspina expedition, where you can see materials, and the bar is 1 centimeter, the white bar. So materials are from below 1 centimeter, a few millimeters long, to more than 1 centimeter in size. And you can find them in different colors, white, blue, and so on. And the colors are significant. They're significant in many ways, but one of the ways in which they are significant is that some of the color of the plastic material is injected through chemicals to confer them greater resistance. For instance, to be resistant against ultraviolet radiation, then most of the material is blue, and the chemical that is injected to confer this property to plastic is actually quite toxic. It's a persistent organic pollutant that is toxic to life. So this plastic, but this plastic also is embedded with persistent organic pollutants that are toxic to marine life, and they're toxic to us as well. So some other elements from Julia's work on the nature of this plastic. This figure shows different size classes of plastic, moving to smallest particles towards the left. And the dark blue are hard plastic materials, the light blue is soft plastic, then you also have plastic line, and eventually also pellets, because the plastics are produced from pellets that are heated to then give them appropriate shapes and forms and then produced into various items. So it's a whole range of sizes of plastic material, Some are very large, like a whale can even die of being their guts clogged when ingesting these materials, and some are very small. But because organisms in the ocean range from very small to large, all of them are under danger of ingesting particles and eventually dying from ingesting the plastic particles. So there are reports of impacts to marine life from ingesting particles all the way from the smallest crustaceans, and that will be copepods, the animal shown in the right, probably about a few millimeters in length, to whales. And beyond the role of these particles as objects that can clog the guts of organisms, as I mentioned before, they are also loaded with an array of persistent organic pollutants, both when they are designed at factory, but also when they are in the ocean. The surface accumulate persistent organic pollutants. So they actually are coated and loaded with these particles, and they trap these persistent organic pollutants and molecules during their transit in the ocean. So their load of persistent organic pollutants actually increases during their transit in the ocean. And there's a paper by Rios and co-workers in 2007 that has a very thorough examination of the range of persistent organic pollutants that can be found in plastic, but that includes toxic additives like phthalates and bisphenol and POPs such as persistent polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, DDTs, and others. So it's a matter of both the chemical load of these plastics, but also their physical role in obstruing the guts of animals. And these particles have very long trajectories in the ocean. They enter oceanic circulation. And a very recent example of how far they can be transported in the ocean comes from the Fukushima, from the accident of the tsunami in Japan in March 2011, if I'm not mistaken, where the wave brought to the sea a huge amount of debris, including whole houses and boats, but a whole array of materials made of plastic. And then this debris entered in the circulation of the North Pacific Ocean. So this figure here shows a model calculation of where the particles should flow from Japan. So the origin of these particles are in Japan, the area hit by the tsunami. All of these materials and debris was flushed into the ocean by the retreating wave, and then they were then transported into the ocean along this pathway. So these are model predictions. And in fact, I tried to go to the webpage of NOAA to update this figure, but because of the budget cut down in the US, the webpage of NOAA and all of the other federal agencies are shut down. So we cannot update this figure. But the colors here represent where the particles are predicted to be at different times. So red is after 1 year, the yellow is, orange is after 2 years, yellow 3 years, and so forth. So you can see that most of them were actually being transported across the Pacific Ocean towards California and Oregon, where they have already started to arrive. And then some of the particles, rather than just hitting the land, they enter in circulation, they make a loop and go south, and then they go into the central area of the Pacific, which is what we call the gyres of the ocean. So most of the circulation in the ocean basins go around the coastlines, and the central parts of the oceans are really relatively stagnant water where materials accumulate, and they have very little exchange with the rest. So in fact, if we look at these yellow materials and the blue materials, they are heading towards what was known as the Great Garbage Patch in the Pacific Ocean. That was discovered by an NGO organization some years ago. And first, the scientists were reluctant that the reports were accurate. And then there were some scientific expeditions gone there to verify the reports. And they indeed found that there was very large amounts of plastics accumulating in this gyre area about northwest of Hawaii. Now, the media sometimes reported this as the Great Garbage Patch or the Great Plastic Island. There is nothing really that you can see as an island. It's not something that you see when you approach it as an island or an aggregation of litter. It just means that the amount of plastic is large enough that it exceeds the biomass of plankton. So there is more plastic than plankton, but you still need sampling devices to collect it and see it. It's not an island, it's nothing that you can walk on. So there's been a little bit of media hype in reporting this patch in the North Pacific. So these were model data, but then there's been observations of the transit of this patch of debris and garbage that was originated in Japan with the tsunami across the Pacific. So the first figure is after 1 year. They were already this far from Japan. And the panel below is in 3 years' time. And 3 years' time will be by March next year. So by March next year is when the landings of debris from the tsunami in Japan to the west coast of the US will be largest. But debris has already started to appear and has been reported in the media and is clearly of Japanese origin. Because when you walk the beaches and see some of this debris washed in the beaches, many of the items that you can find actually have a barcode. So you can read it with a barcode reader and actually identify the origin of the material. So if I was to take a walk around the beach of Cadiz, where this whale was found, I will probably collect items that if I read the barcodes, they will be coming from the Middle East, from Asia, from Russia, from all around the world. It's not produced locally. It's produced all around the world. And then some of that is stranded in the beach. And then when there is a new storm, the stuff is washed again into the ocean and enters again a journey into the ocean around the continental margins and eventually accumulates in these areas of the central regions of the ocean. So even though there's been reports of high loads of plastics in particular regions of the ocean, until now we don't really have a very good survey. And our models indicate that this debris should accumulate in these central gyres of the ocean, but only one of them has been sampled, which is the one in the Pacific. And indeed, in that gyre area in the Pacific, there's a high amount of plastic debris, but we don't really know whether this is true for the other 4 gyres in the ocean. So there's 2 in the Pacific, 1 in the Northern Hemisphere, 1 in the Southern Hemisphere. There's 2 in the Atlantic, but there's only 1 in the Indian Ocean because the equatorial region is occupied by land masses. So it's only in the Southern Hemisphere in the Indian Ocean. But we didn't know as yet whether these high accumulations of plastic in these gyre areas also occurred elsewhere in the ocean. So then we started to engage in a global assessment of the loads of plastics in the open ocean. And the way we sample this is, and Julia uses different devices, but in fact it's sort of very similar technique, is we use something called Neuston samplers, which are, there's one shown here, that is the one that we used for the Malaspina expedition. That was a circumnavigation cruise from which I will be showing results. And this catamaran, a small catamaran, is like maybe 2 meter wide by 3 meter long. It just sails along the research vessel and is skimming the surface of the ocean, the top 10 centimeters, with a net that collects all of the materials, right? So just skimming the top layer of the ocean because that's where the small particle, plastic particle materials accumulates because they're buoyant, so they're on top, right? So we tow this little sampling device for about 30 minutes or so, and then we collect the sample, and then we sort the sample and separate the organisms from the plastic, and eventually we are left with a sample like the one that you can see on the right side of the image. So that's a real sample from the Malaspina expedition, and then we photograph and scan the sample, and then we calculate the size of the particles with image recognizing software, and then calculate how much particles there are per cubic meter of water. So Julia and her co-authors have also been busy doing this type of survey around Australia, sort of a very thorough survey around the coast of Australia, although it is a very large coast to survey, and also some transects. That one is probably coming from Hawaii, I would say, that line coming from the Pacific, and some going across to New Zealand. And that's a total of 7 or 8 cruises that she's been going out collecting the plastics. And Julia has just now, her first paper is now in press, about to be published in Public Library of Science 1. And this is one figure from Julia's paper that shows the amount of plastic around the northwest of Australia in terms of the number of pieces per square kilometer. And you can see that there's a dark patch somewhere offshore Broome. Although possibly, if we look at the trajectories, and Julia is doing this type of analysis, it's more likely to come from Port Hedland than it is to come from Broome. Okay, so what Julia is seeing on her survey is that the ocean regions near cities usually have much higher loads of plastic material, and that can be seen in this other figure where the red and brown dots are areas with high loads of particles in the plastic particles in the water, and you can see that those accumulate pretty much around cities around Australia. And using oceanographic models that are able to hindcast the trajectories of the water masses, it's possible to calculate where these particles are coming from and calculate the origin, and this can be validated with drifters. So it's not only a matter of finding where the particles are and how many of them are, but also finding where are they coming from and what transport system is responsible for delivering to where we find them. And even though sometimes we find the particles near the coast, they might be actually coming from a long journey across entire ocean basins. Okay, so that's a snapshot about Australia. But then what about the global ocean? So in this figure, I summarize the data we have collected for the global ocean. So there's been already some studies published, mostly in the Pacific and the Atlantic coast of the US. But then there was almost no sampling in the southern hemisphere other than the work that Julia and colleagues have been doing around Australia. So basically there was no other data for the southern hemisphere. So then we designed this Malaspina expedition for many purposes, but one of them was also to assess the loads of plastics in the ocean, and particularly to test if those plastics accumulate in the areas that are shaded gray in the map, which are these central gyres of the ocean, where models predict that these plastic particles should accumulate, right? So we conducted this blue transect, the transect that you see in blue, so sailing off again from Cadiz in Spain, south along the Atlantic, then going across Cape Town into the Indian Ocean and across to Fremantle. And we docked in Fremantle in March of 2011, just as the tsunami hit in Japan. And then we sailed to New Zealand, and from New Zealand up in the Pacific to Hawaii, from Hawaii to the Panama Canal, and then again across the Atlantic to Spain. So then we also, because we hadn't sampled the one patch in the South Pacific of Chile, then we also team up with colleagues in Chile to also survey this area, because this was the one gyre of the ocean that we had not covered. But we did that on a separate cruise. So now we have samples for all of the gray zones or the gyre zones of the ocean. So if we just look along the track of the ship from the Spain in the left, around the world towards Spain again in the right, we can see that the loads of particles, this time in grams of material per square kilometer, differ greatly along the ocean. And we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 areas where there's very high loads of particles. And those are indeed the gyres of the ocean, where particle concentrations are 100 to 1,000 times higher than they are in the regions outside these gyre patches. And there was also a particular sea that we are very keen on that we hadn't sampled. And this year in May, we had a cruise called MedSea to also sample the Mediterranean. So we conducted, during a month, we conducted this transit in the Mediterranean, thoroughly sampled the Mediterranean basin to the Aegean Sea and all the way almost to Syria, back into the Adriatic and back to Spain. And then also calculated the loads of particles in the Mediterranean. Because being an enclosed sea with a lot of human action around the shores, then we inferred that this area was likely to also hold large amounts of particles. So then this figure here summarizes all this global data. We have separated the regions inside the gyres and outside the gyres. So you can see that some bars are very high, with lots of particles being very high, and those are all of the gyre areas, and the Mediterranean, which has particle loads that are comparable to the particle loads in the center basins of the ocean. And the areas outside the gyres, they have very low particle loads. Actually, they're very close to the x-axis, so you can barely see them, but because the particle loads are really low. So again, this confirms this model inference that these gyres of the oceans will accumulate the plastic material. So we can see them again here. Here we can see the amount of plastic color by color. So blue is relatively low loads, and red are very high loads. And you can see that the reds are typically in the gray zones that we label, which are the gyre zones of the ocean. So again, validating the model predictions that these particles should be accumulating in the gyres. And also, if we look at how they distribute with latitude, we can see that if we look at latitude from 70 degrees north to 70 degrees south, we can see that there are two peaks, one at about 32 degrees north and a smaller peak around 30 degrees south. Perth is in 32 degrees, so that's very close to the latitude of Perth. So, and those are really the latitudes where the gyres of the ocean are. So we are in the same latitude that the gray zones of the southern hemisphere are, and in the northern hemisphere they're around 30 degrees north as well. But also this graphic shows that the loads of particles in the northern hemisphere are higher than those in the southern hemisphere. And that also makes sense because most of the 300,000 tons of plastic that are produced every year now are actually produced, consumed, and released in the northern hemisphere, where human population and consumption is much larger than it is in the south. But then we were able, with this data and a few assumptions, to integrate and derive a first estimate of what might be the total load of plastic debris in the open ocean. And we came up to an estimate that was surprisingly small. So that was about 10 to 30,000 tons of plastic for the whole ocean. And just remember that in 1 year, and in 2010, we've produced about 300,000. And we expect this plastic to accumulate. So there should be more plastic than the plastic that is produced in a year, although we assume that only about 1 to 5% of the plastic eventually reaches the ocean. So we were expecting values in excess of 1 million tons of plastic, so 1,000 kilotons. So we were expecting about 1 million tons of plastic, and we only found 10 to 30,000 tons of plastic. It's not that we're happy to find that little amount of plastic, but it's much less than we thought we would find. So then this doesn't mean that plastic is not being produced or released. It means that plastic is being lost at sea somewhere. So we need to understand where is this plastic heading and where can we find this plastic and what effects will these plastic materials have wherever they're found if they're not found hanging around the surface of the ocean. So the plastics, when they enter ocean circulation and they're moving around the oceans for years and decades, they are embrittled by the exposure to sun radiation, solar radiation, particularly UV radiation. They become crisp and they break into smaller pieces. And this process is one of the pathways of losses. And in this electron microscope photograph, scanning electron microscope photograph from Julia, you can see that these particle surfaces are crisscrossed with fractures. So they probably are breaking along these lines of fractures and then breaking into very tiny particles. The bar there is 100 microns, so it's 1/10 of a millimeter. So these particles might break below the millimeter size into micron size, and eventually we don't have the capacity to harvest them with nets. And that's why we might be losing a lot of material that is there, but we are not finding it because we are not using the proper sampling device. But in fact, in the Malaspina expedition, we looked very thoroughly at the size distribution of plastic particles. And then if we look at this figure, it's a little bit complicated to read, but I will just give you the bottom line. So the blue points are the observed distribution of size of plastics. So you can see that most of the plastic is in the small length scales below 1 millimeter. So we have plastics, the peak is about 1 millimeter in size. That's where the blue values are highest. But then the red values is where we expect, how we expect the distribution of size of plastic to be with a model that assumes that the plastic is breaking into increasing smaller and smaller units. So if we impose a model of breaking into smaller units, we expect the distribution of plastic to be the red one. And you can see that the red model that is just calculated fits very well the data until a size of about 2 millimeters. But below 2 or 3 millimeters, there is much less plastic than we expect to see. And when we integrate, that is where we find much of the plastic that we're missing. So now we know that there's a lot of plastic being lost, but this loss is not happening at very tiny scales of a micron, but it's really happening at sizes below 2 to 3 millimeters, right? So there may be some of this continuous rupture into increasingly small particles that eventually is responsible for some of the loss, but there's also losses of particles of about 2 to 3 millimeters that we should be able to detect, but they aren't there. So at that point, then we can introduce another finding of the Malaspina expedition, and is that creature there that is a lanternfish, which is technically called a myctophid, and where we have evaluated that the biomass of these organisms, and is one of the subject research organisms of Sean's group. So because it has very large eyes, it has incredible sensorial capacities. It lives in the mesopelagic region of the oceans, around 500 to 700 meters depth. But many of these organisms, they come to the surface every night to feed, and then go down again with the sunrise to be kept in the dark zone away from predators. Right? So they come up and go down every day, and the biomass of these fish that goes up and down every day is the largest migratory flux that happens on Earth, and it happens across the whole ocean every day. So we have now evaluated, I believe for the first time, the biomass of these fish, and our estimates indicate that the biomass of these fish alone is 30 times larger than all of our estimates of the global stock of fish in the oceans, because these have not been evaluated properly, because they cannot be sampled with nets, because they're very good at avoiding nets, because they're so good in sensing pressure and vision. So we believe that these organisms may hold part, not all, but part of the response as to where is the plastic going. Because these organisms are widely distributed across the ocean, they are particularly abundant, and they're the dominant fish species in the central gyres of the ocean, so exactly where we have most of the particle going. And also because we know that the optimal prey size is between 1 and 5 millimeters. So the size of the prey they eat is exactly the size of the plastic that we are missing. And in fact, there's been 2 studies that have looked. They have been able to sample and capture some of these organisms, and they have looked at the guts, and both studies have found significant loads of plastic of that size range inside the guts of these animals. So we believe that the loss mechanism is that 95% to 35% of the guts of these organisms have plastics on their guts. So we believe that one of the mechanisms for the loss of particles, and one that had not been reported to date, also because the abundance of these organisms have been grossly underestimated in the past, is that these organisms go up at night every day, they see a particle, and then they ingest it because it's the right size, and then they bring it down during the night. During the day. They come up in the night and then go down in the day, and they release it down at 500 or 700 meters, or they might hold them inside and eventually die and sink to the seafloor. Now, if the particles are buoyant, perhaps they should be floating back to the surface, but maybe they're loaded and coated with heavy stuff in the guts of the fish, and they lose the buoyancy. So we don't know, but this will be a mechanism that is able to bring the right size of particles that we're missing from the surface to at least 500 to 700 meters depth. So we believe this is one of the mechanisms. And another one of the mechanisms might be also microbial degradation of plastics. And we know that some of the plastic material, as it transits through the oceans, they develop a coat, a bacterial coat, a microbial film, and some of these bacteria are actually able to degrade these plastics. So we haven't really done long-term studies of whether they can degrade the particles completely, but it is possible that a third mechanism for the loss of particles, besides the fragmentation into very small particles or the removal by fish, might be the degradation by bacteria when the particles are already very small. Because that's a little bit of the story as to where are we at in terms of assessing where is the plastic gone, how much plastic there is, and we're still a little bit lost at sea, but we have at least 3 mechanisms that jointly may be able to account for the loss of plastic. So it's not really, 2 of the mechanisms don't really account for losses of plastic. They just account for this plastic being converted into tiny particles or being transported to the deep sea, where we have no surveys nor assessments. And the third mechanism, microbial degradation, is the only one that truly will do away with the particles and remove the particles from the sea. We have also in the Malaspina expedition been looking at the gene pools and the genomics of deep sea organisms, and we were very surprised to find that at 4,000 meters depth in the ocean, we consistently find a very large pool of genes that are coding for proteins that are involved in the degradation of pollutants. So, in fact, we were very surprised, but it makes sense, because it might be in the deep sea, and not the surface ocean, the ultimate sink for these pollutants, but that also signals a very rapid evolution of bacteria in the deep sea, that they have already been able to develop the capacity to degrade these pollutants, even though some of them are relatively recent, that plastics are only 50-year old. But there is potential in looking at these genes as a source of capacity to remove plastics from the environment, and we're looking at that at present. So what solutions we have to address plastic pollution? So first, we need to be aware that the ocean is a large connected system, so that if something gets thrown into the ocean in Japan, it will not land in Australia, but it might land all the way across the Pacific Basin into the US or Hawaii. So it's not sufficient to maintain good stewardship practices in our own country. We need to be looking at what's happening around the basin scale and help those nations that are more challenged to be able to control their emissions of plastics, to be able to cope better with their emissions. We also need to understand better what is the capacity of microbes to degrade plastics, and maybe take some of these bacteria that are coating plastics in the ocean after several years and be able to use them on land, and even if are domestic in our households, to be able to decompose and remove the plastics so they don't ever reach the ocean. There's also new developments, and Julia sent me this link yesterday to a new publication that looks at the use of seaweed material to be able to produce bioplastics. So we can produce now bioplastics with potato peels and other materials, but seaweeds might actually be also a good source of materials to replace our disposable plastics with. So the solution might be also coming from the ocean to this issue, but there's also the option of regulation. And I must say that Australia is not really doing really well, because there's no national law that regulates plastic pollution, but there's at least state bans, like in the Australia Capital Territory, there is an act from the 2011 that regulates the use of disposable plastics. So I will encourage citizens around Australia to talk to their legislators and make sure that this type of bans are introduced elsewhere in the nation, because some other nations that are much more challenged to be able to regulate their footprint, like the Philippines, have already passed an act at the national level in 2011. And in the US, which is one of the main sources of plastic along with China, then again the regulation is on the state competence. So there's some states and cities that ban or regulate the use of disposable plastic, but now there's an act under discussion in Congress when they go back to work. So hopefully this act will be approved and passed, and the US will have a legislation also to regulate and try to control the use of single-use plastics or disposable plastics. But in addition to regulation and research, the most important tool we can use is that of education. So education and outreach and informing people of the impacts of plastics in the environment, and then providing them with alternatives so that they can maintain their lifestyles and consumption patterns if they wish without having that impact on the environment is important. And this is a program that is run by CSIRO called Teach Wild, but which children are brought to the beaches and they participate in beach cleaning activities, and they collect plastics and they assess where the plastics are coming from, and they contribute to citizen-based science because their data is uploaded into a national data of plastic loads in beaches around Australia that is being used by scientists to figure out where the plastic is coming from and where are the areas more vulnerable to suffer from plastic pollutions in the beaches. This is funded by Shell, I believe, in Australia, but it's a nice program that I set in an example. It's working with children, and sometimes children are very able and efficient at influencing their parents, but we hope that their parents participate in programs too. And there's a plethora now of activities, and this is just a collage of posters that I was able to find about different campaigns to try to reduce plastic waste. And last week I was in Malaysia developing research collaborations with a university in Terengganu, and then I went with them to see the island near Terengganu where they do their conservation program called Bidong Island. And in the landing place there was a poster 4 meters by 2 about the perils of plastic and requesting people to collaborate in render our oceans a plastic-clean environment. And we're also doing some initiatives at the Oceans Institute besides doing research, which I think we're making a significant contribution to the global understanding of the fate and distribution of plastic in the oceans, but we are also sharing our insights with the public. So Julia and Guillermo and I wrote this paper in an electronic media called The Conversation in Australia about Take a Stand on Oceans Day and the Plastify Your Life, and we try to raise awareness of how much plastic we use every day and how easy it is if we just make a point of it to reduce the amount of plastic we use. It's not essential for our lives, and we also launched a plastic detox initiative to reduce and eventually even lead to a total abandonment of the use of single-use plastic in the functions of the UWA Oceans Institute. UWA also has a sustainability program, and I hope that we will soon see some initiatives to remove plastic use from UWA at the whole campus scale. So just to end, some home take messages. The ocean is the ultimate sink for plastic debris. Plastic debris affects marine life through the impacts as particles that can be ingested by fauna, but also as a source of toxic persistent pollutants that might interfere with the health of the organisms. We have conducted a global expedition that has been amended with regional studies that confirms that plastic materials accumulates in the central gyres of the oceans, but also shows that about 90% of the plastic that we expected to find is gone. And it's probably gone through 3 different mechanisms, one of them involving these lanternfish. But in fact, this mechanism also conveys a disturbing and concerning message about the health of this important organism in the ocean, because if they are ingesting massive amounts of particles, these particles must be inducing a high mortality on the lanternfish that we really understand nothing about. And I would like to also end with the message that it is possible to revert this trend. It is possible to revert this tide, and it will take very little and very insignificant actions in our lives to reduce the amount of plastic we consume, because it's really one of the main threats to the ocean environment in the 21st century. So thank you for your attention.